Okay, and we just finished up the movie. I hope you were able to hear it. I'm coming back over here because I have my prop. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a nice, relaxing way to sort of chill after a busy day and reflect a little bit on Sanibel. And I think WRT did a really great job. And really excited to just share that with you. And I also thought while I was listening to it that it just I want to share with you that we are doing this exhibit here at the University of Florida, which was always planned to be here in the fall. And then we were going to take this exhibit down to Sanibel and do a panel discussion with a whole bunch of people on November 19th. And so pieces of the exhibition were going to just make their way down to Sanibel, and we were going to continue the conversation. It's important for you to know that here we can have these great academic conversations about sea changes and Ian and storm impacts and what's going to happen to a place like Sanibel. But on the island, it's sensitive and difficult. And they had impacts from Helene and Milton that were not as severe as Ian, but there's cleanup to be done. And it felt really insensitive for us to go and take the exhibit there. And they asked us to delay till the spring when the hurricane season's over and behind. And then we can have these conversations with the community members who are really impacted. But for this, we do want to have these academic conversations about sea change. And I hope that you took away a few things from the video. Obviously, Sanibel's planning legacy began early. We do have a poster up of what an artist visioned would be Sanibel today if there was no Sanibel Plan, complete with high rises and Mickey Mouse ears and high density. But they were able to reduce their potential residential development by 3/4 to protect the island's environmental character and clearly the quality of life. I love Craig Chandler talks about the Sanibel Plan as envisioning the island as a sanctuary. That word comes up a lot in the plan. And this is the community striving for harmony with nature and its neighbors. And if you haven't read any of Anne Spirn's books, like The Granite Garden or The Language of Landscape, it's a message that she promotes in her books. And I think that it's a great tie-in to have Anne Spirn here with us this evening, zooming in from Boston, where she is the Cecil and Ida Green Distinguished Professor of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I'm not going to go on and on about Anne Spirn. I feel like you all probably know a lot about her. Instead, I'm going to let her start her talk and share with you her experiences working on Sanibel, her experiences as a landscape architect, and talk about some of her processes of planning here that have informed how she thinks about landscape and dynamic change. So Anne, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jules. Great that you all just got to see the film. I want to express, first of all, my admiration and gratitude to the residents of Sanibel. The residents back in 1995 who commissioned the Sanibel Plan, who entrusted it to Wallace McHarg Robertson Todd, and also made the courageous, tough policy decisions, who fought to hold true to those decisions in the force of legal threats by developers. Their dedication over the years made Sanibel the place it is today. And I just want you all, you saw how beautiful it is, and it seems like, oh, we had this plan and we adopted it and things just worked out. But when we took on, I was at the time, I was working at Wallace McHarg Robertson Todd. When we took on the project, it was very clear that there were going to be serious legal challenges from developers who had purchased land and who intended to develop in just the way that was mentioned with high-rise resort developments. This was their intention. And so when I use the word courageous, I mean, it really was courageous on the part of the leadership of Sanibel at that time and of the residents who voted for the Sanibel Plan with its stringent restrictions to population growth and to adherence to environmental regulation. So with that, Jules has asked me to share a little bit about what it was like to work at Wallace McCarg, what kind of a firm it was, to talk then about the project itself and my role in it, to walk you through the maps that are on the walls and the diagrams that are on the walls, and point out some things that you might want to look at those maps further. And finally, she asked me to reflect on the impact that this project had on my own career. So Wallace McCarg Robertson Todd, or WMRT as it was known, had four partners. You see Wallace and McCarg, upper left and upper right. They founded the firm in the early 1960s. Dave Wallace was an urban designer. Ian McCarg was a landscape architect. And on the bottom, you see at the left, Tom Todd, and on the right, Bill Roberts, who, as mentioned, was the partner in charge of the Sanibel Plan. Tom Todd was an architect. Bill Roberts was a landscape architect. And the way that the office worked is that each of the partners had their own jobs. Bill Roberts was the lead on the Sanibel Plan and was very proud of the project. But I want to talk first a little bit about how special this firm was. Here you see Ian McCarg in I would say this photograph was taken when he was about 50 around 1970. He published the book Design with Nature in 1969, and it was an office production. The folks, Bill Roberts, who at that time was not a partner yet, produced many of the drawings in the book. But what happened was that it came out, it reached a broad audience, and it served as a powerful marketing tool for the office. There was a very close relationship between the university and the professional office. So Design with Nature reflected in some chapters work done by students in courses, studio courses at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I've done here is I'm showing in pink those chapters. You're seeing the table of contents to Design with Nature. And those chapters in pink, the three chapters in pink, are chapters about cases that were performed by students in studios at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, the interesting thing about this office was that it was also, I would call, a research-based office, at least with McCarg's work and some of Bill Roberts' work and some of Dave Wallace's work as well. The chapters in blue on this table of contents are projects that were primarily worked out in the professional office of, at the time, Wallace McCarg. The ones in purple here, a combination of the pink and blue, are chapters, and you can see there are two of them in particular, the River Basin and the Metropolitan Region, where there was a synergy between the university and the office. When I was a student in the early 70s, I took a studio that was taught by Ian McCarg on the Woodlands New Community. And the office at the time was engaged with this project. And he offered it. He basically had the students looking at some of the issues that they were dealing with in the project in the office. And this was really important for me because this was my fifth semester of 6 semesters in my Master of Landscape Architecture program. And at the end of the semester, I decided to take a year off. And I went to McCarg looking to see if there was any possibility of working at the office, and he hired me. So I moved, for you students in the crowd, this is before I even graduated with my master's degree. I was thrown into this work on the Woodlands, which is now recognized as an iconic project, a new town north of Houston, Texas. And as part of that work during the year I took off in 1973, McCard gave me the opportunity to produce site guidelines for site planning, which was one of the 4 reports produced by the firm, and a report that was given to all architects and planners who would be working in the Woodlands, designing and planning the for the individual subdivisions within the project. So Wallace McCard Robertson Todd was a very special firm. We actually There weren't actually that many people working in the firm, particularly in the landscape architecture and environmental planning area. I went back and did my thesis in spring of 1974. And then in June, when I graduated, came back to work for the office. I started out in 74 working on Partisan, a park for a plan for an environmental park in Tehran, Iran. And then after the Sanibel Plan, I worked on another project, environmental resources of the Toronto Central Waterfront. All very interesting and important and research-based projects. So in between those 2 projects, in 1975, I worked on the comprehensive land use plan for Sanibel. As you see here, this is my dog-eared copy of the plan that we presented in December 1975, which was revised in 1976 before it became official. And I'm showing you this acknowledgments page because the thing about Wallace McCard Robertson Todd, or WMRT as it was known, is that there was great care given to give credit to everybody who worked on the project. So you see here, under consultants, the planners, Wallace McCard Robertson Todd, William Roberts, partner in charge, John Sutton, associate partner, was also a landscape architect who graduated from Penn a couple of years, actually, I think 3 years before I did. And Whiston Spirn, I was in charge of all the environmental work on the plan, and Beth Kitchen was a planner, urban planner, who was in charge of the socioeconomic, cultural aspects of the plan. And then Carol Reifsnyder and Richard Nalbandian had a very special role in the firm. We did a lot of environmental planning work, and it was, McCard felt it was very important to have an in-house natural science specialist. So Carol Reifsnyder had a background in biology and ecology, but she also had a master's degree in regional planning. Richard Nalbandian had a bachelor and master's degree in geology from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and as well as a master of regional planning from Penn. And so these were 2 go-to people within the firm. If I had a question about the work I was doing on the environmental zones of Sanibel, I could just walk across the office and consult with Carol or Richard. The rest of the folks had a relatively minor role in the Sanibel Plan, and included among them are the draftspeople who made the maps. So I think this was really special about WMRT, is that the acknowledgments, if you go to look at any of the reports that we did, at least in the 70s when I was there, everybody who worked on a project was credited, from the partner in charge right down to the person who was coloring the maps. Our legal consultants, really, really important, were Fred Bosselman and Charlie Seaman. Fred Bosselman was one of the leading land use lawyers in the country, and Charlie Seaman was an associate at the time. Unfortunately, Bill Roberts, John Sutton, Fred Bosselman, and Charlie Seaman have all passed away. I realized when I was asked to give this lecture, and I wanted to touch base with them and see if I could include Charlie in particular, because Charlie and I worked very closely together. Apparently, Charlie moved to Florida ultimately and had a very distinguished career as a lawyer, land use lawyer in Florida, but unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. But we worked very closely with the legal consultants. And as you can see at the bottom, we gave some credit to the environmental studies done by John Clark and the Conservation Foundation, the natural scientists who put together the Sanibel Natural System Study, um, on which we based all of our planning. But they didn't do the planning. The work that they contributed was very important in terms of the scientific studies. So this is a flow chart I made as showing the workflow of um, of the project. On the left-hand side, you see all of the detailed studies into, on the upper left, the climate, the hydrology, the geology, the ecology, soils, plants and animals, which primarily came out of the work that the natural scientists and who worked with the Conservation Foundation did. And on the lower left, you see all of the socioeconomic, history, and cultural data that we put together. And then these were synthesized. My contribution, as I mentioned, was mainly in the upper half of the workflow chart here with the ecological zones and management guidelines, et cetera, which I'll go into in a minute, leading ultimately to the land use plan. So here we are in the upper left-hand corner, and as you can see, climate, oceanography, geology, physiography, subsurface hydrology, surface hydrology, limnology, soils, vegetation, wildlife. These were almost overwhelming, but ultimately I brought them within a context, synthesized them within a context of ecological zones. And I'll go through this more carefully as we go through some of the maps. These are all on the wall behind you in the exhibit here at the University of Florida. So here's an example of one of the maps we did on elevation and bathymetry. Elevation meaning the elevation of the land on Sanibel, on the land part of Sanibel. And the blue levels of blue are showing the depth of the water in the surrounding waters. What I want to point out here, which was mentioned earlier but without a map, is that the highest point on the island of 10 feet you can barely see on this map because it's the dark brown. And I challenge you at this scale to find the little dots on the Mid-Island Ridge that represent the 10 feet or over. The beige area, which is just along the Mid-Island Ridge, along Periwinkle, and then along the Gulf Beach Ridge, is just two thin, very thin strips. Most of the island is under 5 feet in elevation. And here you can maybe see it a little bit better, but I still challenge you to find those. I think there are only a few spots of 10 feet or above. And as you can see, the lighter beige color is all below 5 feet above sea level. This other map was very telling. And I was really astounded when we created this map. It's what it shows here. The darkest blue is the water bodies, both within Sanibel in the interior wetland and the lagoons that were created by developers, and the surrounding ocean and bays. The most of the island, this middle blue tone, would be overwashed by the 10-year flood. This is statistically probability of every 10-year flood. Clearly, that's not happened to Sanibel. Ian came along, and there hadn't been that much of a flood tide for many, many decades. So we expected this to happen much, much earlier. The lightest uh, pale blue that you see here is along the Mid-Island Ridge and along the Gulf Beach Ridge. And those are the areas that wouldn't be overtopped except the greater than 10-year flood tides, statistically, probability. So this is pretty sobering map. Here you get a slightly larger view of it. So I want to take you through some of these maps through this flow chart. I came to do my field work in Sanibel for a week in the summer of 1995. I did the field work for Toronto in the winter, the following winter, and I was shivering in Toronto. I said, why couldn't I be doing the Sanibel field work now instead of having done it sweltering in the middle of the summer? But in any case, here's a photograph I took of what the interior wetland looked like in 1975. And it was very important for me. I had been watching these maps. I've been reading the natural system studies that were done by the Conservation Foundation and putting together some synthesis maps before I made the trip. But I remember flying down on the airplane and thinking about how are we going to take all this information and create a plan that is defensible, legally defensible against these threats that were already being made to the newly formed city. And I remember sketching on the plane these sketches of ecological zones, that notion that we could actually take all of this information about climate, geology, hydrology, wildlife, etc., and encompass it, synthesize it within the framework of ecological zones. So we'll take a look at this. Now, of course, here are the historical zones, which I mapped from the aerial photographs of Sanibel in 1944. But by the time we were working in 1975, a lot of this area had already been, and you see in the gray tone, are already developed. So they are outside of performing the ecological functions that they would have as ecological zones historically. And here we can see this more clearly. What you also see on the existing map here is that this vertical hatching is areas that are already in 1995 in conservation zones. And this is really, really important because you have the Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge. So most of the mangroves, almost all the mangroves are already in conservation zone. And a lot of the interior wetland is in conservation zone. So the colors here, I don't know if you could see my arrow. You notice the Mid-Island Ridge is just this very pretty narrow zone along the middle of the island, and the Gulf Beach Ridge here and the beach along the again very narrow zone. The Bay Beach, again a narrow zone. Besides the mangrove area, the largest area within the ecological zones is the interior wetlands, and both upland and what you see with these dots is these are the interior wetlands upland area, and the areas without the dots are the lowland areas. Very, very important area for fresh water in Sanibel, and also for wildlife and flood protection. So we took a look at resources, and here you see the resource map. What I want to do is zero in on the legend first so that you can take a look at what our factors were here. So we identified some historical sites, but we looked at on the one hand, beaches, dunes, gulf ridges, the Mid-Island Ridge, the mangroves, and the wetlands. You see them along the left-hand side of this matrix. And then which ones are important for shoreline stabilization, storm protection, marine ecosystem, flood storage, and freshwater system. You see the mangroves come out as really important, and so do the interior wetlands, as well as the beaches, dunes, and gulf ridges for shoreline stabilization and storm protection. We have a dashed area that's a water management area with the diagonal hatching representing the approximate extent of the freshwater lens. So we have this, well, I'll explain that in a few minutes. And then we have the red outline for wildlife area, areas of particularly important for marine resources, unique avian habitat, unique vegetation, and a unique geological feature. So let's take a look here. And you'll see this mangrove area again is so important. But so is this blue area with the crosshatching. The interior wetland is an area that is a bowl of fresh water. So otherwise you would get the saltwater intrusion from the ocean coming in and filling in the whole area, but this freshwater lens was really important for potential water supply, but wells, but also for the vegetation and wildlife there. And you'll see that there is a whole cluster of important resources in the Ding Darling Refuge, as well as other places. And these black dots are historical resources. So coming back here to this overall scheme, this is within this workflow. Here you have the ecological zones map that's been a synthesis of all of these other maps. You have the resources, and now let's take a look at the hazards. So hazards are the darkest areas subject to constant geological change and flood tides every 10 years. Areas subject to seasonal high water table and flood tides every 10 years. That's the next area in red. Areas subject to flood tides every 10 years, but not subject to seasonal high water. And then finally, areas subject to flood tides every 25 years. And this is statistical probability. It's not what Sanibel has actually experienced since 1995. So let's come back and look, and you'll see that the hazards cover all of Sanibel. But I want to point out this area in the upper left, which is the Gulf Pass area. And this is geologically very active. It's pretty sobering when you take a look at aerial photographs of this particular area every 10 years over a 50-year period. And you see that it is geologically so active because storms come through and completely rearrange the physiography there over time. So constraints then is a combination of hazards and resources which fed into our management guidelines. We'll take a look again at the matrix in the legend. And for the students in the crowd, take a note of how we're using the legend. It's not just a matter of color, but it's also using the legend as a way of conveying the information that's in the maps, that's going into the creation of the maps. So here, and you can see these much more clearly on the wall, we have arrayed here along this matrix on the left, all the different ecological zones, including Blind Pass, the Gulf Beach Ridge plus Blind Pass. And then if we turn this over, you see what's coming on the other way on the matrix is hazards, including constant ecological change, annual flood hazard, storm and flood hazard, wildfire hazard, and then the resources, storm and flood protection, shoreline stabilization, maintenance of water quality, maintenance of freshwater system, maintenance of marine ecosystems, performance standards, standards for maintenance of natural functions. And this again underscores, if we take a look back here at the legend, in constraints, the most constrained is the darkest tone, the least constrained is the lightest tone. And you see right away again that the mangrove area turns out to be the most highly constrained, as well as Blind Pass and the interior wetland. So these then, the hazards and resources fed into the constraints, which fed into the ecological zones and management guidelines, which I'll get into in a minute. So if we go back to these ecological zones, and then what I did was I took a section right through the middle of the ecological zones from Bay Beach to mangroves to Mid-Island Ridge to interior wetland to Mid-Island to Gulf Ridge and the beaches. So what you're going to see next is a diagram that takes that section from Gulf Beach to Bay Beach. And this then becomes a way. The reason that I did this diagram, I did it specifically to take to the city of Sanibel and help people visualize the natural systems and the way that they were playing out in these various ecological zones. So you have this, I drew this diagrammatic section to help people, imagine where they are. And then within each of these, let's take a zoom in on interior wetland basin. I'll be able to show you that more clearly, the way that I worked here. So we took climate, geology, subsurface hydrology, surface hydrology, soils, vegetation, and wildlife. And here you have all the different wildlife species and the different vegetation species in each of these different zones. But right now we're just looking at the interior wetland basin, upland, lowland. And so this is a way of then making a connection between those early reports of the Conservation Foundation about the natural systems and mapping them on to the ecological zones. The next in this is a series of 3 diagrams. The next in the series of 3 diagrams, which are sections through the island, is ecological functions. And let's take a look here. So now we're seeing not a descriptive diagram on the top. We're actually seeing a diagram that helps explain what these ecological functions are and how they're part of natural processes that are working in these different ecological zones. So if we zoom in here to from Gulf Beach to interior wetland basin, you can see here's the 25-year flood tide, the 10-year flood tide. Again, statistically probable, and Sanibel in the last 50 years has not followed the statistically probable. But in any event, you see the 25-year statistically probable flood tide overtops the entire island. The 10-year flood tide overtops, doesn't quite gets here to the Gulf Beach Ridge and you can see how important that Gulf Beach Ridge is for protection from the flood tides. So there's a description of the function that each one of these zones is fulfilling. And then under functions, let's take, for example, interior wetland basin, flood protection, maintenance of water quality, maintenance of freshwater system, maintenance of island wildlife. And then down here, under each of these, you have elements essential to the functions. So elements essential to flood protection, water storage capacity, freestanding free-flowing water circulation. No, I didn't do a close up, but you can go on the wall and follow each of these through. The point here is to be looking at the organization, the framework, making clear what we're doing here is we are taking each of the ecological zones and each of those maps that contribute to the definition of the ecological zones, and we're defining functions that are important for health, safety, and maintaining health, safety, and welfare of Sanibel Island residents. And then clearly going from the functions to the elements essential to the functions. And then from there, we go to management guidelines. What's necessary to support the continuance of those ecological functions of the ecological zones for maintaining health, safety, and welfare of Sanibel residents? And we can zoom in here again. What I did here was, instead of a diagram of the section, was to show an aerial perspective of the island so that you can, again, get a sense of how this is playing out on the island for those folks who live here. And we'll zoom in here again to interior wetland basin just to show you how this is functioning. So we go to the management guidelines. We go to flood protection, which is one of the functions. We go to maintain water storage capacity of the interior wetland basin as one of the features that's essential to maintaining that function. Prohibit development activities which would result in a reduction of freshwater storage capacity. Maintain natural free-flowing patterns of water circulation. Do not impede or impound water flow. Improve the Sanibel River system to provide for continuous free-flowing system, and so on. I won't go through each of these, but you can follow them on the diagrams on the wall. Why is this important? Because what Charlie Seaman did was he translated all of these management guidelines into environmental performance standards, which are now, you have to hold the developers to these environmental performance standards. And they are all tied back into maintaining the health, safety, and welfare of Sanibel residents. So this makes it legally really, I was going to say watertight, pardon the pun, but really, we were really, really concerned about protecting the city from legal liability. So backing up, I hope you can see how the flow happened here. This then, the management guidelines, the constraints, all factored in to the community values and the decisions that the community need to make in order for us to continue and finish the production of the plan. The part that I won't talk as much about, because I don't know as much about it, I wasn't involved in it, is the socioeconomic side. But I will cover some of that in a minute through looking at the Island Reporter's special edition. So on the one hand, all of these socioeconomic factors fed in and the environmental factors fed in. We get to community values. We had to go back at this point to the community and say, now you need to decide whether you want to support, what are your values vis-a-vis these guidelines and this information that we're bringing to you. So we asked for a decision on population threshold. We asked for a decision on natural environmental policy statement. And we asked for a decision on a social environment policy statement. And then these ultimately fed back to us, and then we were able to make maps of permitted uses, unit density allocation, and a land use plan. Now, I got a copy of the Island Reporter that came out in September of 1995. I don't know if there are any others in existence, but I got them scanned at the MIT libraries, so they're now available for anybody, and they're now posted on the walls of the exhibit around you. And I would urge you to really take time to read the whole thing, because the Island Reporter did a wonderful job of laying out for the city what the decisions were that needed to be made and what the information was. They really boiled it down and presented it. And I think it was so important because people had to vote on this, and the Planning Commission had to make some really tough decisions. And as I mentioned before, they were facing threats, legal threats. So this was so, so important for people to know what it was all about. So the Sanibel Plan, planning firm offers 4 growth options for the island. WMRT describes the risks and costs at each growth level. Really, really key. So I've taken you through the story of the ecological zones and how the environmental management guidelines were put together and the performance requirements. But on the other side, what turned out to be really critical was the evacuation. Because as Porter Goss said in the film, his son came to him before it started raining and got him to get off the island right away. Because our study showed that it would take quite a while for people, the existing population in 1995, to get off the island and evacuate. So that was a key factor in thinking about what the threshold, what the growth threshold ought to be, what the maximum number of residents ought to be. And that wasn't our decision as planners. That was put back to the citizens of Sanibel and the mayor and his staff and the planning commission. Also of importance was the sewage in establishing a growth limit, as well as a plan for water. And these alternative growth thresholds, which we laid out, had associated requirements and cost. So the alternative one was a cap of 6,000 dwelling units, which means more than 6,000 people, unless you have only one person living in a dwelling unit. And what we did here was we said, what are the constraints for emergency evacuation? What are the issues for water supply costs? What are the issues for traffic movement costs? Upgrading roads, upgrading water supply. What are the sewage treatment costs? What are the economic values? What are the environmental values and other municipal costs? So alternative 1 was 6,000 dwelling units. Alternative 2 was 9,000. Alternative 3 was 12,000. Alternative 4 was 24,000. WMRT and Bill Roberts went and presented this in the fall of 1995. Our recommendation was option 1, which was the lowest, the 6,000 dwelling unit limit. And that's ultimately what the city decided to go with. We also laid out the environmental 11 major island-wide policies, which related to the environment. And of course, we recommended the most protective options, but that's to my memory where the town ultimately went. Oops. Here we go. So the Planning Commission, this is again the Island Reporter saying, what is the task now facing the Planning Commission? It must make, and this is why I want you to read the Island Reporter, because it really puts you back in time and helps you understand the issues that were facing the Planning Commission and the mayor and the council and the residents as a whole at that time. So the center spread was, which I'll show you in a minute. This is text taken from the centerfold of this special report. While the protection of public safety, health, safety, and welfare in such areas as emergency evacuation and sewage disposal determine the choice of alternative growth thresholds, the decisions regarding such things as density of development and building standards will be determined by the environmental zones. The attitude taken by the city toward protection of the natural system in each of the environmental zones will be of vital importance in arriving at answers on permitted density of development, setback lines, and building standards. The illustrations on this page indicate the historic and modified ecological zones and show the zones in a cross-section profile. And so this is the centerfold. And the text I just read is in the upper right-hand corner. Well, you can imagine, you students, how proud I was that my diagrams got into the centerfold here and were helpful in folks on the island coming to a decision. And again, I want to stress that we went from these zones to the environmental performance standards, which were quite innovative at the time. The performance standards were something being discussed in planning circles, and they were being implemented elsewhere, but I think Sanibel is one of the iconic plans that employed these. So Jules asked me to reflect a little bit on what impact, what did I take away from working on the Sanibel Plan that influenced my career. And I would say one of the most important things was the realization that in order to move from the natural sciences, all of the analysis of and maps of the geology, hydrology, climate, et cetera, to maps that could help us plot action, that we needed to create a synthetic land-based ecological zones. And in this case, physiography and watershed became really important. And so this for me, this landing on the ecological zones was really, really important, and I think that was my major contribution to the Sanibel Plan, frankly. Um, the other thing that was important for my career was the belief that it's really important to be transparent about the planning process, and to communicate clearly to ordinary people, not planners. We have our own way of speaking. In jargon-free, clear prose and clear graphics, the important factors in the decisions they're going to have to make, the important factors that are feeding into a plan. And this became actually, at Wallace McCard, became a recognized part of my job, so that I actually worked on a number of other jobs just as a consultant within the office, doing diagramming and doing helping with the identification of how to synthesize the environmental data into physiographic zones or watershed zones, or whatever the appropriate zone was to that particular project. So I think that this sequence of from the inventory diagram to the ecological function diagram to the management guidelines diagram was also important to take away from my career, and it's something that I've continued to do. Uh, this These three diagrams were something that I took on myself. I wasn't directed to do them by my boss, who was John Sutton and Bill Roberts. I persuaded them, I sketched them out, and I persuaded them this was going to be really important for Sanibel to really help people understand the plan, and also to help the lawyers in writing the regulations. And this was done really for me. I wanted to clarify the process for myself, exactly what the planning process had been, because we were dealing with so many complex issues. And I don't know that this ever got taken to Sanibel. I think I made it. I don't know if it was ever useful to anybody else, but hopefully Jules felt it might be useful to the students to see a process of moving from all of this data on the left-hand side through to decision-making and a plan on the right. And finally, I think one of my biggest takeaways from the Sanibel project was that there is a great, great difference among people in tolerance for risk. I thought that this map would be would scare the wits out of people. To know that the statistically probable 10-year storm was going to, cover much of the island. Um, and Fred Bosselman, for example, the word was that Fred Bosselman, who was this great land use lawyer, nationally known, agreed to take on this project with us because he was thinking of retiring to Sanibel. He was a fisherman and he enjoyed taking vacations to Sanibel. And the next thing I learned a few years later was he decided to retire to Colorado and fish for trout instead of being a marine fisherman. But this I think that was perhaps one of the biggest takeaways for me was this was not a risk tolerance that I was willing to take, but that others were perfectly willing to take, and they've fought for years to make the decisions they made and to keep to the plan and to increase the conservation area and to fight for keeping to the performance requirements. And God bless them. They they have created a place that's much more resilient than it would have been if the plan had not been adopted and if they hadn't made the tough political decisions to do what they did. So thank you for coming with me on this journey of memory and reflection, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Questions from anyone in the audience? Yep, Andy.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much. That was a great talk. I had a question about the diagrams that you made and how many times do you think you had to remake those diagrams before you kind of ended up on this great synthesis of all this information?
At the time I made the diagrams, it was towards the end of our work, and we were going to be, it was probably the end of the summer or beginning of the fall. So I had already assimilated all of this information, and there was only one draft of the diagrams. Could I have made those diagrams at the beginning of the project? No. No. I hope that answers your question. I mean, it really was a reflection. Again, it was a way for me to clarify the process and to clarify the thinking and to make it as clear as possible for the people who had to make the tough decisions. I think that's something that landscape architects and planners sometimes forget, is how important it is to speak and write free of jargon, to speak in plain English and in plain graphics. There's a lot of complex graphics around today that ordinary people can't read at all. And I'm really concerned also, and if you know my books, I write for a general audience as well as a professional audience. And to do that, I have to tell a good story and I have to speak in plain English. And I have to make arguments, in and evidentially based in plain English. And I think that's so important to remember.
Hi, Anne. Thanks for your talk again. Just following up on what you mentioned, I was wondering if you could touch upon a point that I've heard you make in conversation previously with us about the process of hand drawing versus working digitally. Thank you.
Well, so I have to tell you, when I first started at Wallace McCarg, Robertson Todd, I was one of the folks working to create maps, and I was working on the woodlands, and not only did I make some maps that were of, just essentially copying vegetation maps so that it was to put them all in the same format. So I wasn't doing any synthetic work in that sense. But I was also creating maps where you had to overlay one or two or three types of information. And so you did that on a light table. Light tables used to be features in all landscape architecture studios and all professional firms. Because what you have is a light table is where you have these lights underneath shining up through a transparent surface so that you can see through multiple layers. And you're looking for the correlation among different kinds of factors. And even when I was doing the vegetation maps, say, or the geology maps, I was always thinking, so this process of coloring them, you notice, and they usually had topography on them, contour lines. And so I'm noticing the correlations between topography and the information, the whatever data it is that I'm recording. And particularly when I'm overlaying maps and drawing them, and seeing the correlation between, say, hydrology and vegetation or something like that. After I had worked, by the time I was working on the Sanibel Plan, I was no longer allowed to color maps because I was told by the partners that I was too senior to do that and that they had draftsmen. And I tried to explain, but you don't understand. I have my best thinking when it's not a rote kind of job. I'm thinking the entire time I'm coloring. I'm noticing things. I need to color the maps in order to do what I want to do. And they weren't persuaded. So I had to learn how to uh, how to work around that. And it takes time because noticing significant details. And I remember working with Narendra Janeja, who was an associate partner on the Toronto project, and we had these. I was project director, so I was in charge of all the production, and Narendra, and I wasn't allowed to do the coloring myself, and so I was supervising a draftsperson. And Narendra would come up and say, "Hey, what's that?" And he'd point to something on the map that it wasn't right. And I was mortified that I hadn't been able to see it. How did you see that? And he just kind of stood back and smiled. And I realized that it was just experience. But it takes experience to notice anomalies and notice significant details. And I think that the fact that students today don't go through the process of coloring maps means that they have just that less experience of poring over a map for hours while you create it, because you're not just thinking about your next vacation or where you're going on the weekend or whatever. Hopefully while you're doing it, you're thinking about what you're coloring and what meaning it has and impact it has on what action you're going to take. So I guess my advice would be for students today is to learn to spend a lot of time looking at the maps that you create on a computer and look for anomalies, which what I would call significant details. Anomalies are often some of them, but another significant detail might be something that's prevalent. And you say, and ask questions. Why is that anomaly there? What's going on there? What process is creating that? Or if you see something that's not rare at all, it's common, that can be easy to overlook. What is causing the prevalence of that element? So ask lots of questions. Don't just take the maps for granted. And then run some sections through the information, like I did with Sanibel. Run sections and see if you can see different kinds of correlations and anomalies through the sections, and think about how the sections are really helpful in helping you think about what's going on underground as well as what's going on above ground, the roots of the plants and where the water is and the water table. So just, and then when you start thinking about what correlations do I want to explore? Most recently, the last 40 years, I've been looking at the correlation between urban vacant land and buried rivers. I discovered it by just that, seeing an anomaly in the map of vacant land that we made and saying, what is causing that pattern? So look for pattern. Even if you don't, even if the map just, you can make it happen on your computer very much more quickly, look for pattern. Why is that pattern there? What processes could explain it? Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Was that Eleanor?
Was. Yeah, that was Ellie.
Yeah.
Megan has a question.
Hi, Anne. Thank you again for sharing. I'm Megan. I continued the Sanibel work, looking forward for the next 50 years, and used your work as a blueprint, if you will, for my overlay maps. And as you mentioned, the one that's behind you right now, you said it was a bit jarring and you thought that would really scare the residents. I now, creating these maps, I think you can only imagine what my statistics are reading for the next 50 years. Would you give any advice on the delivery now of how that might be taken, knowing that they are seeing these between Hurricane Ian, Milton, and the ones that we've seen over the past few years, or the delivery, or how giving this to residents outside of a academia perspective?
I think, I think the way forward is to try to be helpful. Is to just think, well, you grew up in Sanibel, right? I mean, to help people, I think this is scary. And to help people reckon with these facts and with what's to come, and to help people think of alternatives. How can we continue to occupy Sanibel, which we love? You heard Porter Goss say again and again, this is my home. And in the film. And it's, people are very attached to place, and specifically to this place. So how can we help people continue to live here? One is evacuation. Two is perhaps over time, people will be ready to think about living differently on Sanibel. Maybe things can be done through engineering and architecture to build. I saw a couple houses on stilts. The historic buildings, by the way, that when we were working in 1995, I remember one of them that survived the 1944 and 1925 hurricanes it was up on pilings. And to help people think about maybe where they store their precious possessions so they don't lose their photos and, all kinds of treasures, to maybe after a time, and I'm talking about over 10, 20 over years, over time. It may take some people time to think about how to occupy differently, but how to preserve what they value about living on Sanibel and still preserve their lives and livelihoods and personal treasures. And maybe in many, many years from now, it'll be more like a place where you have a type of architecture where it can fold up and you leave and evacuate, and it's something where the water can just washes over, and then you come back and it opens up again. And now I'm thinking, this is fiction. But it will be a long process. I don't think people aren't ready to leave Sanibel. They've fought for it for so long. And I don't know if this answers your question, but designers can help a lot. And I think that's why I like the performance requirement. If you go back to those performance requirements, you think about how can we occupy Sanibel in such a way that we do so in such a way that we meet all of these performance requirements.
That's great
Um,
insight. Thank you.
Yeah. I like the performance requirements because they're not dictating. They're saying, if you can figure out how to do this, then sure, it's okay to occupy this spot.
Any other questions? Yes, Ashwarya.
Hi, and thanks so much for this wonderful talk. I have a question about your field work. When you went down there, took pictures, observed the landscape, how did that inform your mapping and how did it change it? And what kind of field notes did you take, especially to help the students here understand what goes into digesting all this data?
Yes. Well, I'd already done a lot of mapping before I went into the field. I took my camera with me. You saw that black and white photograph of Sanibel in 1995. I took maps with me, base maps with me to make notes on. As I said, I developed this notion of the ecological zones. I believe it was on my way down there. I can't remember whether, it was 50 years ago. I can't remember whether it was on my way down or on my way back. But the ecological zone idea really gelled in the field. And I really could experience these zones. And I had some amazing experiences there. I went alligator hunting with this guy that I met at lunch or dinner. I think it was in one of these, I think there was only one main restaurant spot. And we got into conversation, and he was an alligator tagger. And people would get in touch with him when an alligator was in somebody's swimming pool, or, it was in a parking lot, a place where it wasn't supposed to be, and he would catch it and transport it back into a more appropriate location where it would be happier. And so he said, would I like to go alligator tagging with him that night? You go at night, because he had these lights that you put on your forehead, like, so that when you see the alligator, their eyes glow because they're on the water surface. So, I met people like that who took me to places I otherwise wouldn't have gone, and to appreciate things in ways that I wouldn't if I were just back in Philadelphia making maps. So fieldwork is really important to me. I think I'd probably say I'm never happier than when I'm out in the field with my camera in my hand. Now I also always take a journal with me as well, so I'm writing in the field. I think I probably was making field notes on a base map back then when I was at Wallace McCarg. But I do remember the diagram that I drew, because I could draw it from memory, the the various different ecological zones, the shape of Sanibel, and then I was kind of sketching in these diagrammatically where these zones were. Yeah, so really nice question, because I think, field work is so important, and it's when you use your camera, don't just go click, 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 really think about what you're photographing and look for significant detail. Like I was talking about with the maps, the same thing is true when you're out in the field. You're looking for anomalies, saying, what is shaping this land, what processes are shaping this landscape? Ecological processes, social, cultural, historical processes, what's going on here? And how can I capture that if you're doing a drawing, a section, a diagram, or a photograph?
Hi, Ann. This is Tom Ankerson. Thanks
Hey,
for
Tom.
Hey, this has been great. I guess I have an observation and maybe you could comment on the observation. But when Megan was working on this, she used, of course, your ecological zones as the basis. And what she concluded, using sea level rise statistics and so forth, is those zones are moving. And jurisdictionally, they remain the same, and the city jealously guards them. So as those zones move, the basis for the performance standards and management guidelines and so forth need to move too, but the city is afraid, I shouldn't say afraid, but is reluctant to tamper with that because it has been so successful. So it's sort of, the plan has been a victim of its own success in that sense, at least in terms of addressing the 50 years going forward.
Yeah, I would say they're probably, some of the zones are more dynamic than others. The Blind Pass is just like crazy. I just remember looking at those aerial photographs and going, how can anybody live here? This is just so geologically active, hydrologically active. That's a real conundrum, Tom, and it's really important to think about. I don't, not knowing exactly how the ecological zones may have changed, it's hard for me to comment, except that, yes, it does, I mean, ecological systems are changing. I mean, they do change. And so it's a tough one. After Sanibel, I've mainly worked with the kind of ecological zones I work with are watersheds and physiographic regions. And if you're on a barrier island, which is so environmentally active, most of the environments I work in are not anywhere near as environmentally active as this. So it's a challenge, but I think it has to adapt. The plan has to adapt, and I would hire a really good land use lawyer like Fred Bosselman and Charlie Seaman to help think this through. Because but I would be fascinated to actually know what in particular is changing. I'm
And if
sorry,
we
I
haven't
can't
done
really, it's hard for me to answer without knowing more of the particulars, except that I think you do have to adapt.
Yeah, I guess I haven't sent you Megan's thesis, but I'll make sure I do that after the talk so you can see the work. Well, can we give a big round of applause, please, for Anne? Thank you.
And again, I want to thank the residents of Sanibel and the leaders on Sanibel for all the amazing work that they've done over the years and are still doing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Anne. And yeah, I agree. We were able to collaborate with so many great people in Sanibel to even get this far with the exhibition. But Anne was so generous as we were planning this this evening event by sharing with us the drawings that were about to be packed up and sent to Harvard's archive, I believe. Is that correct? And your drawings are all going to Harvard?
Yeah, but I don't have the original drawings. They were all in the possession of Wallace, McHarg, Roberts, and Todd. And so all I had were slides, which we scanned. So the slides are going to my archive at Harvard, but unfortunately, WRT threw them all out.
Yeah.
So they're gone.
They're gone.
I
And
did those original diagrams on Mylar, and they're gone.
yeah,
I
it's-
only had them in my portfolio as well as slides.
Yeah, it was really sad. The only thing they could find at WRT to send us was one of the original copies of the Sanibel Plan and a couple other things, but all the maps, they were gone. So we were so fortunate that Anne had the slides and she was able to reproduce them so well for us. And this exhibition will be up for the week. We're going to hold classes in here during the week, including a junior high class that's going to come from to see the exhibit and talk about the landscape and planning. So we have some really exciting things planned. I wanted to let you all know that the shell art that came from Sanibel, which was delivered by Megan, which you saw people making on the island when you saw the movie, is here from the island, and it's for sale. So if you fall in love with a shell sculpture, I thought they were fascinating when we were there, and I really think they add some great texture to our exhibit. So they'll be here all week as well. I hope you enjoy those as well. Last week, we were, many of us were together in Kissimmee, at a flood adaptation symposium where we were talking about many Florida communities who are experiencing more than normal amounts of flooding and high tide scenarios and storm surges. And obviously, the talk here tonight explains to our students perhaps how to do a better job or do a good job of thinking through ways of doing planning so that you can come up with a very defensible answer or idea that you could then share back with the public. And I hope we see many of our students doing more of this work in the future. Anne, thank you. This has been a terrific evening. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much.